Welcome to what I hope will be the first of many lecture series that I'm going to do on this topic. I hope that the information that I share in the next few minutes, you find it to be useful. I started this series because I had taken some time to think, to ponder, to reflect on my life. And I asked myself a series of questions. And one of the questions that I asked myself was, if I had my life to live all over again, could I and would I do things differently? And as you can imagine, and I'm sure if you ask yourself the same question, you might come up with the same answer that I did, which was yes. And that got me down a path of asking another question, which was, okay, what would you change? What would you do differently? What would you do more of? What would you do less of? What have you done well? And I started to come up with an idea about a series, a lecture series, very different to what I had done previously. And this lecture series, I wanted it to be a little bit more valuable. I didn't just want it to be insightful. I didn't want it to be informative. I didn't want it to be just inspiring or motivational. Now, I don't mind whatever category you choose to put this lecture series in. I don't really mind. What I wanted was something that was going to be impactful, something that could make a difference. And so in thinking about a topic, I decided that I had had such a beautiful life. And I'll explain what I mean by that. That I had a beautiful life, and it would be really useful to connect my teaching series to the experience that I had had in the past. And I came up with a topic which was what I wish my father had taught me. It's an interesting topic, and the reason is simply because speaking from a male's perspective, we get our sense of self-worth, self-identity, self-image from our fathers. And I know there's a lot of you might say stigma. There's a lot of concern about boys and men and the path that we're going down lately. And I can't consider myself to be amongst the lucky group who had the rare opportunity to have been raised by an incredible man. And so I'm going to be teaching today one part of what I think will be perhaps a journey of many stories, a journey of sharing ideas. But to begin today's session, I'm going to just lay a foundation so you can understand that the topic title does not suggest and should not suggest that perhaps I wasn't guided properly, or perhaps my father failed in some way or the other, because the opposite is the case. I'll give you perhaps an overview about my childhood. An incredibly intelligent man has 3 kids. One of them is probably about 1 year old, and the eldest is roughly about probably 4.5, 5 years old. In between the youngest and the eldest is myself. So I was probably roughly about 2 plus, probably going on 3. And at that point in time in this young man's life, obviously, things didn't work out in his marriage, and he separated from his wife. But he made a decision that he was going to raise the kids. Quite different. Normally, it's the lady or the mother who takes the kids, and the father provides support. But my father decided, I want to raise these kids myself. And I have very fond memories of growing up, even till today. Still have a great relationship with my father. I used to say when I was much younger, and I still say that today, that if I become half the man my father is and was, that I think I'll be an exceptional father, and I think I'll be a great person. And the reason is simply because he was very principled, very loving, very caring, made a lot of sacrifices, and he raised each and every one of us in a unique way. 3 boys, sadly 1 didn't make it. 2 of us are still alive. And so in looking back at my life and looking how far I've come, I realized there were so many things and so many principles that I learned from my father. But as I journeyed through life, I recognized that there were some very specific areas of life that I had wished that my father had taught me. And here is the point. I had idolized my father, and therefore whatever he taught me, I believed to be the truth. And whatever he didn't teach me, I resisted the information. And in many cases, most of us struggle in life, not as a result of lack of knowledge. As a matter of fact, most of us struggle in life as a result of ignorance. But even worse than that ignorance is the fact that we struggle as a result of the fact that we are closed-minded because we believe that the knowledge we have is sufficient. And if you weren't taught that at home by your parents, then probably wasn't as important. And as a result of that, for so many years in my life, I resisted change. Until I got to a point where I realized that the results that I was creating in life were my results. And if I had to change the results that I didn't like, I had to change myself. That it wasn't something outside, it wasn't the economy, it wasn't the government, it wasn't faith, it wasn't destiny, it wasn't bad luck, that it was me. To change my life, I realized I had to change myself. But to change myself, first of all, I had to change a number of things in my life that formed who I was. One of them was my philosophy, or the principles that I had developed, that I had used as a foundation to build my life. Now, I didn't have to change all the principles in every area of life. What I had to do was look at the principles and the beliefs that I had, and I just had to ask myself a question. Is this principle, are these beliefs leading me towards the goal and the vision and the life that I wanted? Whenever the answer was no, I had to take some time and ask myself some more questions, such as why? Is it obsolete? Is it the correct information? And what I found was the principles that my father had taught me, the ground principles of character and integrity and honesty and hard work and being willing to pay a price and sacrifice for something you want and treating people right, following the golden rules, were perfectly fine. I didn't have to change that. All I had to do was just apply that and keep applying that. But there were a few areas where I struggled, partially because I left home very young. And probably at that point in my life, I was susceptible to peer pressure. So I started learning things from other people to fill up the voids that I had in my life. And as a result of that, I had mixed principles. Some of them worked, especially the ones I learned from my father, and others didn't work. And so I started thinking a few years ago about what I would like to do if I could impact my kids with my principles, my values, my beliefs, some of the big ideas that I thought were important to have, for them to use as a foundation, but not for them to simply accept them. What I wanted to do is provide the information so they could say, this is what my father believed in, but give them enough information in such a way that they could train their minds to be curious, to be intelligent, to be able to think inductively and deductively, to gather information, to seek for other principles that other people have, to mix all of them together and choose the right ones. Because you see, in the absence of a role model telling, or a mentor telling a mentee that the information he's passing down or she is passing down is not absolute. Depending on the age and the experience of that mentee, it's possible that they might believe what you've given them to be the truth and the only truth. And partially that's the reason why we have a lot of problems in our society. Most people have been conditioned to a certain belief system. And unfortunately, they do everything that they can to avoid considering anything outside that belief system. I like to use the analogy of a coin usually, where I say that there are three sides of every coin. You have the heads and you have the tail, but you also have the edge. And you have to have the discipline and the foresight and the intelligence to stand on the edge of life. If you stand on the edge of life, you can see both sides of the coin. We call both sides perspectives. So you can see a different perspective. And guess what? Perspective allows you to see further. It helps you form your vision. Now, Scott Fitzgerald was the one who said that the sign of first-rate intelligence lies in the ability to hold two opposing ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. And that simply is almost analogous to the coin idea, which is, can you stand on the edge of the coin and could you hold two different perspectives and still be able to think rationally and still be able to interact with people and interact with life? Anyway, let me come back to what I was trying to say. So if I look back at my life, growing up, raised by an incredible father, and I might probably have to do a series where I just talk about what I learned from my father. I think that might be a good one because there's so much I learned. But my father raised us, each and every one of us, incredibly well. I left home at a young age in pursuit of my goals and dreams, and for that reason, in a way, I broke that link, that nurturing link, the teaching and the training, and that meant I had to seek information elsewhere. And unfortunately, I adopted a number of philosophies and attitudes and ideas and activities of other people that weren't really good for me. So the first series, what I'm going to talk about first will be the importance of knowing who you are. And that is one thing I wish my father had probably grounded in me, the importance of knowing who you are. Now, let me put that in a statement that might be a little bit more neutral. The importance of knowing self. The importance of knowing self, meaning, who am I? Now, the question, who am I, is a question that has actually provoked and motivated and inspired people over so many generations. Theologians, scientists, philosophers have sat down and asked the question, who am I? Some people call that question the birthplace of the study of life. Before you start doing anything else, you should stop and ask yourself, who am I? Now, Socrates was the one who started with the question, know thyself. Know thyself. Now, you see, to know yourself, first of all, you have to do one very important thing, and that is you must study yourself. And that I wish I learned very early. How do I study myself? And first of all, what is self and who am I? If you study self, you will know self. And here the most important part of the equation is you then have to become who you really are. So I found growing up, being young, being exposed to different influences around me, that I was almost changing constantly. My identity of self or my self-identity often changed. Now, some of you may not really have experienced anything like this. But if you look across our society today and you look at people, what you find is that there's so many people who, and this is not a criticism, I should make that very clear, because I did this for so many years, but there are so many people who do not know who they are. Now, usually when I ask, who are you? When I ask that question, most people give me responses such as, I'm a doctor, I'm a scientist, I'm a mother, I'm African, I'm American, or you might say, well, I'm a naturalist, I'm vegan. So we describe ourselves either based on our occupation, based on our values, based on our passion, describe ourselves based on our responsibility, like a father or a mother. We have various things that we use to describe ourselves. But you see, all of those descriptions is not you. And I'm going to move into probably what might be a controversial perspective about life. I offer no apologies. It's my perspective. I don't ask you to adopt it, but here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Take the information, don't discard it immediately. Don't reject it immediately. Just take the information, receive it, and then just let it sit in your mind for a few days, a few months, and come up with perhaps a game. Play a game with me here where you might say, well, I don't really agree with him, but I'm going to try and prove him wrong. But to prove him wrong, I'm going to start with a premise, which is I'm going to assume that he isn't wrong. And I'm just going to go with the flow. And I'm going to test the thesis, because if you think about it, scientists, what do? We take a hypothesis and we try to, I wouldn't use the word discredit, but we're trying to prove that it doesn't work, or we're trying to prove that perhaps it does work. Now here is what I'll start with, which is, what I wish my father taught me was this, that if you understand the importance of self-identity and self-image, that you can have any life that you want, and you'll be less susceptible to peer pressure, influence from other people, and making the wrong decisions and choices in your life. The question, who am I? Mark Twain said the two most important days of your life, number one, is the day you were born and the day you find out why. For you to understand the why, you must know who you are. Every one of us has an image of who we are. My self-image as a young boy, I took that image from my father. Most people do. Most people, we take that self-image from either someone we love or we care for, but more importantly, someone who has been responsible for nurturing us. So for many people, and probably for you watching right now, you might find that your sense of self-worth is very, very, very closely linked to what you believe about yourself. And what you believe about yourself is based on an identity. That identity is based on a self-image. Let me digress. Let me use an example. If you go down to Africa, and you go down to where you have like the safaris, and you have a lot of beautiful animals, at a young age, a baby elephant is taken from the wild, and perhaps a piece of rope is put around its leg. At that age, it's still very young and fragile. That piece of rope is put to a stake, to a very strong piece of rod, stake, and it's pinned to the ground. In other words, the person who's taking care of that baby elephant is trying to restrict the elephant to stay in a particular location. Whenever the caretaker wants to move, he unties or she unties the stake and the rope and walks with the elephant. At a young age, that baby elephant is conditioned into believing and accepting that there are limitations. Limitations to what it can do and limitation to its strength. Now, because the baby elephant is still quite young, it might want to leave. It might want to go play. And it pulls and pulls, but it cannot pull out the stake, which has been pinned by an adult into the ground. It tries as much as it can to set itself free, but it realizes, you know what? This piece of rope, it's much stronger than I am. So it stays where it is. Now here's what's really, really remarkable. Many years after that experience, the same baby elephant would have grown into a full-grown elephant. Huge, strong, so powerful that it can pull down buildings. But that baby elephant will not, and I use the word baby elephant, though it's grown up to be what you might call an adult elephant. That adult elephant, perhaps that's a better word to use, will not pull out that stake from the ground. Although it's very powerful, although all it has to do is just walk. It doesn't have to even struggle. It just simply has to walk, and that stake will be pulled off the ground. But it stays there, restricted, because it's been conditioned to believe that it doesn't have the strength to pull out the pin. In other words, a baby elephant doesn't have a self-image. It doesn't have a self-identity like human beings have, but it has instincts. But what's happened here is at a young age, through conditioning, you see, behavior becomes habitual. Through conditioning, it's realized, I've done this so many times, and I failed, and I failed, and I failed. Therefore, I cannot do it. That baby elephant will stay there even when it's hungry. Even if it's when it's starving, it will stay there and die. The adult elephant that has grown, that has more power, will stay there and die if it's hungry, because it doesn't believe that it can pull out that little stake from the ground towards freedom. Now, in the same way, you and I have an image of ourselves, an identity of ourselves, and that identity has been formed and fashioned by so many factors. Our environment, our relationships, our experiences from the past. In many ways, if you've gotten to the point where you've actually started becoming open towards ideas, you might even start to have goals and dreams and visions. Those will affect your self-identity. More than anything, your mistakes from the past, your failures, your experiences. When you group everything together, it gives you an understanding about who you are. And if you're not careful, it forms and molds. I like to use the word self-portraits. With that information, I use those experiences and those habits that you have, those relationships and environment and association. I like to call them colors. And you use those colors to paint your portrait. In other words, you now have a self-portrait painted by all of these colors that represent either your experiences or your past. And in many cases, that portrait, we place that portrait in a particular part of our lives. We see those every day, and it defines us. And here's probably one of the most important things I'm going to share in today's session. Whatever defines you, limits you. Whatever defines you, limits you. If you define yourself as a doctor, you're limited in some way, because now you can't have a conversation with other people because they will say, well, you're just a doctor. Or you will see yourself as just a doctor. Whatever defines you, limits you. And you and I, unfortunately, have in some way been defined. Your responsibility, and what I wish my father had really taught me, was you can change that image of self whenever you want, however you want. But you have to be careful, because whatever you choose defines you. So my hope is that as you listen to this, you start to come to the realization that you're not your past, especially if you've made mistakes from the past. Most of us, we beat ourselves up with our past mistakes, past failures, all the things that we probably shouldn't have done, but we did. We use that as an obstacle to restrict us from moving forward. But here is something you should understand, and I struggled with this, and I hope you don't. Your past and your present does not equal your future. Your past is like a spent check. Your present is like who knows? I use the reference. I think it was Andrew Lyons who used that quote. I'm trying to get in my head. It's not coming together. But he said, I believe, or she said, that your past is like a spent check. Your present is like the future is like a promissory note, yeah? And your present is only cash you have, and that you should spend your cash wisely. I think it's something like that. Forgive me. The exact words escapes me now. But the point was this. The more you look towards your past, and you look towards the mistakes you've made and what you've done, the more you focus in one direction. And wherever you focus, that's where you put all of your energy. That's where you put all of your time and attention and emotion. And unfortunately, the more you look at that part of your life, it defines you, because you start to see yourself as the person that you used to be. And whatever defines you, limits you. The more you look towards your past, the more you let go of the destiny of the future. And I like what Paul says from ancient script. He says, forgetting the things that are behind me. Forgetting the things that are behind me, I move towards what lies ahead of me. And that simply means let go of your past, let go of your self-identity that hasn't served you well, and decide who you want to be. What do you want to do? Where do you want to go? How would you want to live? Each and every one of us has a self-image. Doesn't matter who you are, but you have a self-image. Your self-image governs the trajectory of your life. It decides the kind of person you will become in the future. It decides what you have. It decides the kind of friends you will have. It decides, in many ways, it limits what you can achieve, because your self-image is that part of you that you use to form a foundation of your life. And so one of the things I wish I had learned from my dad was the importance of recognizing that when you've made a mistake, that mistake may have come as a result of perhaps a philosophy you had, a principle you had, influence, perhaps the emotional state you were in at that time when you made the decisions or when you made choices. But it's not you. That you're like an evolving being. And at any time in your life, you have the ability to decide what the next moment will be. And one of the ways you do that is by first of all saying, you know what, I'm going to start all over again. I'm going to start with a blank canvas. I'm going to now paint a portrait of who I want to be. I'm going to act like the person I want to be. I'm going to live into the vision of who I want to become. And if I do it with conviction, if I do it with emotion, if I do it with passion, if it's a burning desire, if I apply hard work, if I'm willing to pay the price and sacrifice and put in effort, that someday that I would achieve that dream and I'll look back and say, wow, I have changed. So lesson number one, what I wish my father had taught me was that I have a self-image. I have a self-identity, but my self-identity is not formed and is not fashioned by one person. And that I had a choice, and I still have that choice to be able to change that self-identity or that self-image. Now let me give you my definition of what I think you might find interesting. I've thought about for several years how I could answer the question, who am I? And I've studied theology, I've studied psychology, I've studied history, I've studied psychology, I've studied a lot. I've looked around trying to find answers. But more importantly, I studied a lot because I was scared of being wrong. I was scared of being in the wrong, and therefore I wanted to test a lot of what I believed in, and I could only do that by finding competing ideas. One of the most important things you and I have to do in life is surround ourselves with people who have different ideas and philosophies about life. You don't want to surround yourself with people who believe and think just like you. It's one of the biggest mistakes most people make. What you're looking for is what we call an idea meritocracy, meaning you want competing ideas, and the ideas can disagree with each other, but you want to keep your focus on the outcome. And the result you want from your life should be your focus. And by that, what I simply mean is, if you say, well, I want a good life, the question is not, well, do I keep to this belief or that belief? The question should be, what will get me to achieve that goal? And then that means you have to research and look for people and interact with people and engage on an intellectual level, observe, study, model, try. And whatever you find that works, just have the courage to try it. If your beliefs are not helping you, if your self-image, if your self-identity right now hasn't got you to where you want to be, here is a recommendation. Maybe it's time to change. It doesn't mean you have to discard it right now, but just try something new. Try something else. If your way is not giving you the results you want, if your way is not working, try something else. Someone once said that an insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. I have to say this, in many cases, I've acted like an insane person. Just doing the same thing, expecting it's going to change. Applying hope. But you see, hope has conditions for it to work, just in the same way that faith has conditions for it to work. You don't apply hope doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. And the reason is simple, because this universe is designed to function by some very, very simple laws. And if you understand universal laws and principles, then one of the things you learn about universal laws is that it cannot violate itself. The principles cannot be violated. And therefore, it doesn't matter how much faith and hope you have. If what you're doing is violating a natural law, you're going to wait a long time and you will see no change. So one of the things we all have to do is, in many cases, sometimes just set aside hope and just simply say, what am I doing? Is it working? Is it not working? If the answer is it's not working, the next question should be, what else can I try? And that process begins by not being too fixed on this image you have of yourself. Now, let me go back and define self. I think this is important because I'm going to conclude very shortly on this definition. I used to think that I was my name. I used to think that I was my ethnic origin. I used to think that I was simply my father's son, and therefore I was my father in many ways. I used to think that, for example, my particular beliefs defined who I was. I made a decision to change all of that not too long ago. Simply because I got to a point where I decided to think for myself. And I think that's probably one of the things very few people do. Someone once said, thinking is the hardest thing that we're capable of doing, and that's the reason why very few people do it. In another place, it says 2% of people think. 3% of people think that they think. 95% of people will rather die than think. We've gotten to the point where we just accept other people's opinions. If there's some validity or it's been done for a long time, we just say this is the case. It's fine, let's just use it. And so I got to a point where I just said to myself, well, who am I really? And I started thinking deeply. And I came up with a definition that you may not accept, and that's okay. Who knows, I may not even accept myself. I may not even have accepted it myself a few years ago, but hey, we learn, we live, we love, we learn. But I'll just ask that you listen. If you want to understand yourself, you have to understand life, because everything that has been created in life has a purpose. There is a divine purpose, and then there is a man-made purpose to life and in life. I believe that nothing happens without a purpose, that there's a purpose behind everything that exists. The universe operates, in my opinion, perfectly based on a predefined purpose.